The woman in the cream-colored blazer reached across the aisle, snatched the little boy's toy fighter jet out of his hands and dropped it on the cabin floor like it was something dirty. "Stay and coach where you belong," she said. "You're just trash pretending to belong up here." 40 passengers heard it. Not one said a word. The boy's father didn't even look up. He just bent down, picked up the toy, and put it back in his son's hands. Calm. Steady. Like a man who had stared down far worse than a rich woman's contempt. What none of them knew, what they wouldn't learn until the wheels touched down at an Air Force base 2 hours later, was that this quiet mechanic in grease-stained boots had a call sign once whispered with fear across 3 continents. Before we go on, do me a favor. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. And if you believe a man's worth was never about his clothes, subscribe and stay with me to the very end. Daniel Carter had learned a long time ago that the cheapest thing in the world was other people's opinion of him. He carried that lesson up the jet bridge at Denver International. One calloused hand wrapped around a battered duffel bag, the other holding the small, warm fingers of his 7-year-old son. Ethan was talking a mile a minute about altitude and thrust vectoring the way he always did when he got nervous, and Daniel just listened, nodding, letting the boy fill the silence between them. "Daddy, do you think we'll get to see the wing from our seat?" "Might do, buddy. Depends where they put us." "I hope we're over the wing. That's the best part. You can see the flaps move." Daniel smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. 35 years old, and he felt 60 most mornings, but his son could still pull a real smile out of him without trying. They had spent the last of the emergency fund on these tickets. Daniel didn't tell Ethan that. The boy didn't need to know that his daddy had picked up 3 weekend shifts and skipped lunches for a month, so the two of them could fly out to Virginia to bury Ethan's grandmother, Daniel's own mother, and that the only seats left on the only flight Daniel could afford to take the time off for were the upgraded ones bought with miles he'd been saving since before his wife got sick. So no, they didn't look like business class. Daniel knew that. His work boots were scuffed to the gray. His jeans had a permanent shadow of motor oil at the knee that no detergent on earth could lift. His hands were the worst of it, he supposed, in the eyes of people who measured a man by such things. Years of engine bays had pressed grease so deep into the creases of his knuckles that it had become part of him, like a tattoo he'd never chosen. He'd stopped apologizing for them. A flight attendant near the front gave them a polite professional smile as they boarded. Then her eyes flicked down to the boots, to the hands, to the boy clutching a scratched-up plastic F-22, and the smile changed just slightly. Got tighter. Got more careful. Daniel had seen that change 1,000 times. It didn't sting anymore. Mostly. "Row 4, he murmured to Ethan, steering him down the aisle. "Right up front. Fancy, huh?" "We're in business class." Ethan's whisper was so loud it carried half the cabin. "Real business class. Real as it gets." "Partner." They found their seats 4C and 4D, 2 wide leather chairs that probably cost more per inch than everything Daniel was wearing. He lifted the duffel into the overhead bin, settled Ethan into the window seat, and folded his own large frame into the aisle chair beside him. That was when he felt it. The attention. The woman across the aisle in 4A had turned in her seat to look at them. Cream blazer, a watch that cost more than Daniel's truck, hair done in that expensive way that only looks effortless. She was looking at them the way you'd look at something that had wandered in off the street and sat down at your dinner table. Daniel met her eyes for half a second, nodded once, polite. "Morning." She didn't answer. She just turned back around, and Daniel heard her say to the man beside her, not quietly, not trying to be quiet, "I'm sorry, but isn't this cabin supposed to be screened?" The man chuckled. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose and looked out the window past his son's head. 3 years. 3 years he'd been swallowing this exact thing in grocery stores and parent-teacher conferences and the lobbies of doctors' offices, and he'd gotten good at it. He'd gotten good at being a stone the water just ran over. But Ethan heard it too. That was the thing about kids. They heard everything. "Daddy," the boy said quietly, pulling at his sleeve. "What did she mean?" Screamed. "Nothing, buddy. Adult stuff." "Is she mad at us?" "No. She's just having a rough day, I think." Daniel reached over and tucked a stray lock of hair behind his son's ear. "You know how sometimes you have a rough day and you say things you don't mean?" Ethan considered this with the deep seriousness of a 7-year-old. "Like when I told Marcus I hated him and then I cried." Just like that. "Okay." Ethan went back to his toy jet, walking it along the armrest, making the low rumbling sound of an engine in his throat. "Phew! Hawk 1, you are cleared for takeoff." Daniel went very still for a moment. Then he smiled a small private thing and looked back out the window. The other passengers filed in around them. Daniel watched them come, cataloging them the way he cataloged everything, an old habit, one that had kept him alive once in another life he didn't talk about. The businessman in 3B who wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. The young couple in 5A and 5B already arguing under their breath. The 2 flight attendants doing their dance up and down the aisle. Bate. And the woman in 4A, who he'd already started thinking of as the Blazer because he didn't have her name and didn't want it. She'd taken out a laptop. She typed in sharp little bursts, and every few minutes she'd glance over at Daniel and Ethan with an expression like she'd smelled something gone bad. When the lead flight attendant came through doing the pre-flight check, the Blazer flagged her down. "Excuse me." Her voice was pitched to Carrie. "I want to make sure, is there a dress requirement for this cabin? Or a behavior policy? Because the child has been making noise since we boarded, and I have a presentation to prepare." The flight attendant, her name tag said Rachel, glanced over at Ethan, who at that exact moment was sitting perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, looking up at the adults with wide, anxious eyes. "He seems pretty quiet to me, ma'am," Rachel said carefully. Well, he wasn't, and frankly, the Blazer lowered her voice, but not enough, never enough. "I'm not sure they're in the right cabin at all. People do that, you know. They sneak up here when no one's checking." Daniel felt the heat rise up the back of his neck. Not for himself, for the boy. He kept his eyes forward and his voice level. "We're in the right seats, ma'am. Bought and paid for. I've got the confirmation right here if you'd like to see it." He started to reach for his phone. "I'm not talking to you," the Blazer snapped. The cabin went quiet. That particular kind of quiet where everyone is listening and pretending they aren't. Rachel, the flight attendant, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Sir, your boarding passes are fine. There's no issue." "Ma'am, if you could just—" "I'd like to be moved," the Blazer said. "Is there another seat? I'd genuinely prefer not to spend 2.5 hours next to this." She gestured. At Daniel. At his son. At his boots and his hands and everything she had already decided about him. Chaz. And little Ethan, who had been holding so still, who had been trying so hard to be good, finally couldn't hold it in anymore. "My daddy's not a this," he said. His voice cracked right down the middle. "He's my daddy." Something twisted in Daniel's chest, sharp and hot. The Blazer rolled her eyes. "Wonderful. Now it's a scene. Hey." Daniel turned in his seat. He didn't raise his voice. He'd learned a long time ago that the men who raised their voices were the ones who'd already lost control. "You can say what you want about me. I've heard it all, and worse, believe me. But you don't talk about my boy like he's not sitting right there. He's 7. He can hear every word." For just a second, just 1 second, something flickered across the Blazer's face. Then it was gone, papered over by that brittle contempt. If you can't control him, perhaps you shouldn't have brought him. She turned the toy jet over with one manicured finger where it sat on the armrest between the seats, then flicked it. It tumbled off the armrest and clattered to the floor of the aisle. "And maybe leave the toys at home next time. This isn't a daycare." Ethan's lower lip trembled. He looked down at his jet lying on the cabin floor, the toy he'd gotten for his 6th birthday, the one he slept with, the one he'd named after a call sign he didn't even know was real, and his eyes filled up. Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt. The whole cabin seemed to lean in. But he didn't do what they expected. He didn't shout. He didn't grab the woman's arm. He simply stood bent down in the aisle and picked up his son's toy. He turned it over in his big grease-stained hands, checking it for damage the way a man checks something precious. Then he sat back down, leaned over to Ethan, and placed the jet gently back in the boy's lap. "There you go, buddy. No harm done. Hawk 1's still flying." Ethan threw his arms around his father's neck and buried his face in his shoulder. And Daniel, over the top of his son's head, looked at the woman in the cream blazer with an expression so calm, so completely unbothered, that it seemed to unsettle her more than any shouting could have. "You ought to know," he said quietly, just to her, that the worst thing a kid can learn is that there are people in this world who'll decide who he is before they know one true thing about him. I've spent 3 years trying to teach my son that those people are wrong. He paused. "Thank you for the demonstration." The blazer opened her mouth, closed it, turned back to her laptop with 2 red spots burning high on her cheeks. And a few rows back somebody muttered, "Lady was out of line." But nobody said it to her face. They never did. The engine spooled up. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied out, and lifted off into a hard blue Colorado sky. For a while, Ethan watched the world fall away beneath the wing, his nose pressed to the glass, his earlier tears forgotten the way only a child's tears can be forgotten. He pointed out rivers and highways, and the tiny toy cars far below. "Daddy, look how small everything is." "Sure is." "Did it look like this when you—" Ethan stopped himself. He glanced sideways at his father, then back at the window. "Never mind." Daniel looked at him. What, buddy?" "Nothing." But the boy's cheeks had gone pink. He pulled his toy jet a little closer. Daniel knew what his son had almost asked. "Did it look like this when you flew?" Ethan had been asking variations of it for a year now, ever since he'd found the photograph. The one Daniel kept in the bottom of a drawer under the socks where he didn't have to look at it. A younger Daniel in a flight suit helmet under his arm, standing in front of a machine that looked like it had been carved out of the sky itself. Ethan had found it while looking for his lost soccer cleats, and he'd carried it out to the kitchen, holding it like a holy thing. "Daddy, is this you?" Daniel had told him a half-truth. "That was a long time ago, buddy. Before you." And he'd taken the photograph and put it back in the drawer, and they hadn't talked about it since. The truth was a heavier thing, and Daniel hadn't figured out how to hand it to a 7-year-old. The truth was that there had been a time when men he'd never met knew his name. When his call sign got passed around briefing rooms like a legend. When the things he could do in the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor weren't taught because anyone could learn them, but because young pilots needed to see what the edge of possible looked like. The truth was, he'd been the best. Genuinely, no exaggeration, one of the best to ever strap into that aircraft. And then Sarah got sick. Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned his face to the aisle so Ethan wouldn't see it. Stage 3 when they found it. By the time the doctors finished saying the word aggressive, they were already talking about months instead of years. And Daniel Major, Daniel Carter Hawk. The man who'd never once flinched at a problem he couldn't outfly, had stood in a hospital hallway and understood for the first time in his life that there was a kind of war he couldn't win. Nice. So he'd stopped trying to win it. He'd started trying to be present for it instead. He put in his resignation papers 3 weeks after the diagnosis. His commander, Colonel Briggs, had sat across the desk from him and said, "Carter, you don't have to do this. We can get you compassionate leave, we can work something out, the Air Force takes care of its own." And Daniel had said, "Sir, my wife is dying, and my son is 4 years old. There's only one place I need to be, and it isn't in a cockpit." Briggs hadn't argued. He'd just stood up, come around the desk, and shaken Daniel's hand like it was the last time he'd ever see him. It nearly was. And Sarah held on for 14 months. Long enough for Daniel to learn how to braid the doll's hair. She insisted Ethan keep how to make the specific grilled cheese she liked, how to sleep in a chair beside a hospital bed. long enough for her to make him promise, gripping his hand with what little strength she had left, that he wouldn't let her death turn him into a ghost, that he'd live, that he'd let Ethan have a whole father, not half of one. "Promise me you won't disappear into it, Danny. I promise." She died on a Tuesday in October, with the leaves coming down outside the window. And Daniel Carter, who had flown the most advanced fighter aircraft on the planet, came home, took off his uniform, and got a job at a transmission shop because it was 3 blocks from Ethan's preschool, and the hours were steady, and a 4-year-old needed his father home for dinner more than the world needed another fighter pilot. He'd never once regretted it. Not when the money got tight. Not when the other dads at Little League looked at his oil-stained hands. Not when women in cream blazers decided he was trash before he'd said a single word. Because every night he came home to a boy who launched himself across the living room shouting "Daddy," like Daniel was the best thing that had ever happened, and that was worth more than every medal he'd left in a box in the attic. "Daddy?" Ethan's voice pulled him back. "Yeah, buddy. That lady." The boy was quiet now, picking at the edge of his toy jet. "She said you were trash, and that man laughed." Daniel turned and looked at his son. Really looked at him. The kid had Sarah's eyes, that warm, searching brown, and right now those eyes were trying to figure out something far too big for them. "She did say that." Daniel agreed. He never lied to his boy, and it wasn't kind of her. "Is it true?" The question landed like a fist. "No," Daniel said, and there was no hesitation in it. Nothing performed, just bedrock certainty. "It is not true, not even a little bit." "But how do you know she's rich? She has a fancy computer and a fancy watch, and—" "Buddy." Daniel reached over and took his son's small hand in his own enormous ruined one. "You see these hands?" Ethan looked down at them, nodded slowly. "These hands are dirty because they've been busy. You understand me? Every bit of grease in here came from fixing something somebody needed fixed. A mama who needed her car to work so she could get her own kids to school. An old fella whose truck broke down and couldn't afford the dealership. These hands have been useful, Ethan." Daniel's voice was rough, now low. A man's hands getting dirty just means they've been taking care of somebody. There's no shame in it. There's the opposite of shame in it. Ethan stared at his father's hand in his. So when somebody looks at a man's clothes or his hands, or how much money he's got, and decides right then and there what kind of person he is, they're not telling you the truth about him. Daniel squeezed gently. They're telling you the truth about themselves. You hearing me? I'm hearing you, Ethan whispered. You remember that. Long after I'm gone, you remember that one thing your daddy told you. The whole world will try to teach you to measure people by the wrong stuff. Don't you do it. You measure them by what they do, by who they take care of. That's it. That's the whole list. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he climbed half out of his own seat and pressed himself against his father's side, and Daniel wrapped an arm around him and held on. Mommy. Across the aisle, the woman in the cream blazer had gone very still over her laptop. She wasn't typing anymore. She was looking at the seat back in front of her, and the 2 red spots had faded from her cheeks, and her jaw was set in a way that suggested she had heard every single word and didn't quite know what to do with it. She didn't apologize. People like that almost never do. Not right away. Pride is a hard thing to set down once you've carried it a long way. But she didn't look at them with contempt again either. For the rest of that first hour, she simply sat there typing in shorter and shorter bursts, until eventually she stopped typing altogether and just stared out her own window at the clouds rolling past beneath the wing. Maybe she was thinking about her presentation. Or maybe, and Daniel would never know for sure, maybe she was thinking about her own hands and what they'd ever been useful for, and what it might mean that a man she'd called trash had just taught his son more about dignity in 30 seconds than she'd learned in 50 years. The flight settled into its rhythm. Drink carts rolled, the seatbelt sign blinked off. Somewhere behind them, a baby fussed and went quiet. Ethan, worn out from the early morning, and the crying and the bigness of everything, drifted off to sleep against his father's arm, the toy F-22 still clutched in both small hands. Daniel didn't sleep. He never could on planes anymore, too many years of being the one responsible for keeping the thing in the air. So he sat there motionless, letting his son's weight rest against him. His arm long since gone numb, and him not caring even a little, and he watched the clouds go by. He thought about his mother in her casket in Virginia, who'd held Ethan as a newborn and called him her little aviator. He thought about Sarah and the promise. He thought about money and the truck that needed a new alternator, and whether he could pick up another Saturday shift when they got back without missing Ethan's soccer game. He did not think not even once about the fact that he'd been one of the finest fighter pilots his country had ever produced. That part of his life was a closed door. He'd shut it himself on purpose, and he had no intention of opening it again. He had no idea that in a little under an hour, a warning light he couldn't see was going to flicker on in the cockpit forward of him. He had no idea that the pilots up front were about to start a quiet, careful conversation about hydraulic pressure and the nearest suitable runway. He had no idea that the nearest suitable runway happened to belong to a United States Air Force base, one where if a man wandered into the right hangar and said the right thing about a turbine engine within earshot of the wrong young pilot, the entire careful architecture of his anonymous, peaceful, hard-won, ordinary life was about to come crashing down around him. For now, Daniel Carter just held his sleeping son and watched the sky he used to own slide past the window and let the world believe whatever it wanted to believe about the trash in Seat 4C. He'd carried heavier things than their contempt. He'd carry this a little while longer. Orchestrated emotional narrative with dialogue-heavy pacing and strategic mini-climaxes. Orchestrated emotional narrative with dialogue-heavy pacing and strategic mini-climaxes. The Blazers' silence didn't last. People like her never could sit long with a thing that made them feel small. 40 minutes into the flight, somewhere over the brown flatlands of Kansas, she snapped her laptop shut, turned in her seat, and aimed her voice across the aisle like she was firing a shot. "You can stop performing now. The boy's asleep. There's no audience." Daniel didn't turn his head. "Wasn't performing, ma'am. That little speech about dirty hands, very moving. Did you rehearse it?" "No." He kept his eyes on the seat back in front of him, his son's weight warm against his arm. "I say it whenever he needs to hear it. That's the only rehearsal there is." She made a small sound through her nose, something between a laugh and a scoff. "I've met 100 men like you. You wear the hard times like a medal, poor and proud. As if struggling makes you noble. Didn't say it made me noble." Now he did look at her slow and even. "Said it made my hands dirty. Those are different things. You're the one who jumped from one to the other." That landed somewhere. He saw it land. Her mouth tightened, and for a second the practiced contempt slipped and something rawer showed through underneath something that looked almost like a person. Then she rebuilt the wall. "What is it you do exactly? Fix carburetors?" "Transmissions mostly. Carburetors are mostly gone now. Cars run on computers these days." He said it without heat, like he was just correcting a fact. "But I'll fix whatever rolls in the door. Brakes, alternators, whatever a person needs to get to work the next morning." Fascinating life. It pays for his shoes. Daniel glanced down at his sleeping son. "And his shoes are the only thing on this whole plane I actually care about. So yeah, fascinating enough for me." The man beside her, the one who'd chuckled earlier, leaned over and murmured something. She waved him off without looking. She wasn't done. She had the look of a person who couldn't stand to lose an argument, even one nobody had asked to start, even one with a man she'd already decided was beneath her. "You know what your problem is," she said. "I've got a list, ma'am. Which one are we doing?" A passenger 2 rows back laughed out loud at that and tried to cover it with a cough. The Blazer's eyes flashed. Your problem is that you've made peace with mediocrity and you've dressed it up as virtue. You sit there in your filthy boots and you tell that child that money doesn't matter and hard work is enough and it's a lie, and someday he's going to learn it's a lie and he's going to resent you for it. The words hung in the recycled air. And Daniel Carter, who had buried a wife who was flying to bury a mother who hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night in 3 years, felt the old steadiness in him go very, very quiet. Not angry. Quiet. The kind of quiet that used to settle over him at 40,000 feet right before everything got decided. My son, he said softly, is going to learn a lot of things. Some of them are going to hurt. That's life, and I can't fly him around all of it much as I'd like to. He paused. But the one thing he is never going to learn from me is that a person's worth comes out of their bank account. Because I have known men with everything who weren't worth the air they breathed, and I have known men with nothing who I would have followed straight through the gates of hell, and I have buried some of them. As the blazer blinked. You don't know one true thing about me, Daniel went on, and his voice never rose, never cracked, just stayed level as a held breath. Not where I've been, not what I've done, not what I've lost. You took one look at my hands, and you wrote the whole story. And lady, the story you wrote is not even close. He turned back to face forward. Now I'd be obliged if you'd let my boy sleep. He cried this morning because of you. He doesn't need to wake up to round 2. And for a long moment, she said nothing. Then very quietly, almost to herself, what have you lost? But Daniel didn't answer. He'd already closed the door. And the question just sat there in the air between them unanswered, while the plane droned east and the woman in the cream blazer turned slowly back to her window with something working behind her eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. Ethan stirred against his father's arm. Daddy? The word came out fuzzy with sleep. Are we there? Not yet, buddy. Go on back to sleep. Were you talking to the lady? Daniel hesitated. Just a little. Was she still being mean? She was just asking questions, partner. People ask questions when they don't understand something. It's all right. Ethan rubbed his eyes with the back of one small fist and sat up a little straighter, blinking around the cabin like he was checking that the world was still where he'd left it. His toy jet had slipped down between his leg and the armrest, and he fished it back out and held it up to the light. Daddy, can I ask you a question? Always. The picture I found. The one of you. The boy's voice dropped the way it did when he knew he was walking up to the edge of something. In the drawer, under the socks. Daniel went still. You said it was a long time ago. Before me. Ethan turned the toy jet over in his hands, not looking at his father. But it's the same plane. The one in my hand. It's the exact same one. Lots of those planes out there, buddy. No. Ethan said it with the absolute certainty of a child who has memorized something with his whole heart. I counted the things on the wing, in the picture and on my toy. They're the same. It's the same plane, Daddy. You were standing next to it. You had a helmet. Daniel let out a slow breath. He had known this conversation was coming. He'd known it since the day the boy walked out of the bedroom holding that photograph like it was made of glass. He'd put it off and put it off, told himself Ethan was too young, told himself there'd be a better time, a better place than 30,000 feet over Kansas, with a stranger in a cream blazer pretending not to listen 6 feet away. But his son was looking at him now. Those brown eyes. Sarah's eyes. And Daniel Carter had made a great many promises in his life. And one of the oldest, one of the truest, was that he would never ever lie to this boy. Yeah, he said quietly. It's the same plane. Ethan's whole body went rigid. You flew it. I flew it. You flew it! The boy's voice shot up an octave, and he clapped a hand over his own mouth, eyes enormous. Then, in a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout, Daddy, you flew an F-22 Raptor. For a long time, before you were born and a little after. Daniel kept his voice low, gentle. trying to bring the boy down to earth even as the boy was clearly trying to fly straight off it. It was my job. In the Air Force. You were in the AIR Force. I was. Ethan looked down at his toy, looked back up at his father, looked at the grease-stained hands, then at his father's face, then back at the hands like he was trying to fit two pictures together that didn't seem to belong in the same frame. "But you fix cars," he said. Not an accusation, just a 7-year-old trying to make the universe make sense. If you could fly that "why do you fix cars?" and there it was. The real question. The one Daniel had been dreading, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he had one, and it was the truest thing he knew, and he wasn't sure his boy was old enough to carry it. He decided to trust him with it anyway. "Sit up here a second." Daniel shifted, turning so he could look his son full in the face. "I'm going to tell you something I haven't told you yet because I thought you were too little. But I think maybe you're not too little anymore. You think you can handle a grown-up answer." Ethan nodded so hard his hair flopped. "When your mama got sick." Daniel's voice caught just slightly, just for a heartbeat, and he steadied it. "When Mama got sick, the doctors told me she wasn't going to get better. And I had a choice to make. I could keep flying, which meant being gone. Months at a time sometimes. Bases far away. I'd come home, I'd leave again. That's the job. It eats your whole life and you let it because you love it and because somebody's got to do it." He swallowed. "Or I could come home. For good. And be there. Every single day she had left and every single day after with you." Ethan was very, very still now. "There was no contest, buddy. None at all. The second I had to choose between the sky and you two." Daniel shook his head slowly. "There was no choosing. There was just you. There was always just you." "You gave it up," Ethan whispered. "The flying. You gave it up for me. For you and for Mama." "Yeah." Daniel reached out and cupped the side of his son's small face in one enormous ruined hand. "And I want you to hear me real good right now, Ethan, because this is the important part. I would do it again. 1,000 times. 10,000. If God came down this aisle right now and said, 'Daniel, you can have the sky back. You can have all of it, the speed and the medals and your name in every briefing room in the country. But you have to give up your boy,' I'd tell him no so fast it'd make his head spin." Marcy. A tear slid down Ethan's cheek. He didn't wipe it. "You're not a thing in a drawer, buddy," Daniel said. "You're the reason the drawer's even closed." For a moment, the boy just stared at him. Then he launched himself across the armrest and wrapped both arms around his father's neck and held on so tight, Daniel could feel the small, frantic beating of his heart. "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, partner. More than the sky. More than anything that's ever flown." And across the aisle, the woman in the cream blazer was crying. She didn't make a sound. She had one hand pressed flat against her mouth, and she was staring out the window at nothing. At the white, nothing of the clouds, and the tears were running silent down her face and dripping off her jaw, and she wasn't wiping them either. The man beside her noticed and started to say something, and she shook her head once hard, and he stopped. She had asked the man what he'd lost, and without ever meaning to, he had just told her. Not to her. He'd told it to his son. But she'd heard every word, and somewhere in the hearing, the careful contempt she'd built her whole morning around had simply come apart in her hands, like wet paper. She didn't apologize. Not yet. She wasn't ready, and Daniel wasn't looking, and the moment belonged to a father and a boy, and not to her. But something in her had changed, and she knew it, and it scared her a little. Up in the cockpit, a light came on. Nobody in the cabin saw it. It was a small light amber on a panel forward of the bulkhead where no passenger could see, and the captain saw it before the first officer did, and said one word quietly that wasn't a curse, but was close to one. "Huh." The first officer followed his eyes. "Hydraulic system 2. Pressure's dropping." The captain tapped the gauge with one finger, the way pilots have tapped gauges since the dawn of flight, as if a tap might convince it to lie. The needle didn't lie. Slow, but it's dropping. Could be the sensor. Could be. The captain didn't sound like he believed it. He'd been flying 22 years, and he'd learned to respect the small amber lights more than the big red ones, because the big red ones were honest, and the small amber ones were the ones that snuck up behind you. Pull up the chart. What have we got out here? What's close? The first officer was already pulling it up. Not a lot. We're between everything. Wichita's behind us. Kansas City's still a ways out front. He stopped, frowned at the screen. There's a military field, closer than either. McConnell looks like no wait, that's not this one's not on the commercial. Air Force. Air Force. The captain was quiet for a second. The needle dropped another hair. Get the dispatcher on the line, he said. And get me whoever's running that field. I'm not crossing 200 more miles of nothing on one hydraulic system and a prayer. He keyed his mic. And tell the cabin crew to button up, nice and calm. No drama. I don't want a single passenger back there knowing a thing's wrong until I decide they need to. Back in the cabin, Daniel Carter felt it before he heard it. It was nothing anybody else would have noticed. A change in the engine note, faint, the kind of thing you'd only catch if you'd spent 10,000 hours listening to machines tell you the truth about themselves. A small adjustment in the trim. The nose dipping by a degree that no instrument in the cabin would register, but that his body, his old pilot's body, registered like a hand on his shoulder. He sat up straighter. Ethan, still tucked against his side, felt his father's whole posture change. Daddy? What's wrong? Nothing, buddy. Daniel said it automatically. But he was listening now. Really listening. His head tilted slightly, his eyes gone distant and sharp at the same time. Probably nothing. But he counted. Old habit. He counted the seconds between the small sounds, and he felt the descent begin. Gentle, controlled nothing. A regular passenger would clock, and he knew the way, he knew his own name, that it was too early and too gradual to be a normal descent into anywhere they were supposed to be going. They were going down somewhere they hadn't planned to. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Bye. A flight attendant's voice came over the speakers, smooth as glass, betraying nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has switched on the seatbelt sign. We're going to ask everyone to return to their seats and fasten your seatbelts at this time. Nothing to be concerned about, just a little routine. We'll have more information for you shortly. Thank you. Nothing to be concerned about. Daniel almost smiled. He'd said those exact words himself in a different uniform, in a different kind of aircraft, on days that turned out to be a great deal more concerning than that. He knew that particular shade of calm in a voice. He'd worn it. He reached over and tightened Ethan's seatbelt with one steady hand. Belt on tight now, partner, just like we practiced. Are we landing? Looks like we're going to land somewhere, yeah. Daniel kept his voice easy. Light. Might not be where the ticket says. Sometimes planes do that. They find a closer spot to set down and have a look at things. Ethan's eyes were wide but not yet frightened. He trusted his father's face more than he trusted his own fear, and his father's face was calm. Is it broken, the plane? Maybe a little. Daniel never lied to him. But you want to know a secret about planes, buddy? They're built so that even when a little something breaks, the whole thing keeps flying just fine. They've got backups for the backups. Whoever's up front flying this thing is going to set us down soft as a feather, you watch. Across the aisle, the Blazer had heard the calm in the announcement and read straight through it the way frequent flyers do. Her face had gone pale under the tears that had dried on it. Her knuckles were white on the armrests. It's not routine, she said. To no one. To herself. They don't put the sign on like that for routine. Day. And then before Daniel could stop himself, before he even decided to, he leaned across the aisle and spoke to her. Not because she deserved it. Because she was scared, and he was constitutionally incapable of letting a scared person sit in their fear if he had something true to give them. Hey. His voice was low, steady, meant only for her. Listen to me. The descent's smooth. You feel that real smooth, controlled. Nobody's fighting that airplane up there. Whatever's going on, they've got time and they've got it handled, or we'd be coming down a whole lot faster and you'd know it. He held her eyes. Breathe. You're all right. Your job right now is just to breathe and keep your belt on. Can you do that for me? She stared at him. The man she'd called trash. The man she'd called mediocre. The man whose son she'd made cry, who was now the only calm thing in her entire field of vision, leaning across the aisle to talk her down off a ledge of fear she'd climbed onto all by herself. How? Her voice shook. How do you know it's smooth? How can you possibly know that? Daniel held her gaze for one beat longer than he should have. And something flickered behind his eyes. Something old. Something he'd spent 3 years and 1,000 swallowed insults keeping locked behind a closed door in the back of himself. Let's just say, he said quietly, I've been up front of a few of these before. He sat back, tightened his own belt, put his arm around his son. Die. The blazer kept staring at the side of his face. The pieces were turning in her mind, slow, refusing to fit the story she'd written, demanding a different one. I've been up front of a few of these before. What did that mean? Up front of a few airplanes. He was a mechanic, a car mechanic, with grease in his knuckles and holes in his boots. Wasn't he? That's what she'd decided. That's what the evidence said. But the evidence had been wrong about everything else, hadn't it? The plane banked gently, turning off its eastward heading and onto a new one, a southward one, toward a thin gray strip of runway that was just starting to resolve out of the haze a long way down and a long way ahead. The captain's voice came over the speaker, and this time it had a little weight in it, just a little, just enough. Folks, this is the flight deck. I'll level with you because you'd figure it out anyway, and I'd rather you hear it from me straight. We've got an indication on one of our hydraulic systems that I don't love. The airplane is flying just fine. I want to stress that she is flying just fine. We have full control and multiple backup systems, but I'm not in the business of taking chances with you good people on board. So we're going to set down at a field a little ways ahead of us. Get some folks to take a look and get you on your way just as soon as we can. It's going to be a normal landing. You won't feel a thing different. Cabin crew, prepare the cabin. And folks, thank you for staying calm. You're in good hands up here. The cabin held its breath, and in seat 4, C, an old fighter pilot who had set down aircraft far more broken than this one on runways far shorter than the one ahead, in conditions far worse than a clear Kansas afternoon, closed his eyes for just a moment and let out a long, slow breath. Of all the fields in all the country, the captain had picked a military one. The closest suitable runway. Pure chance. Pure dumb, blind chance. Daniel didn't know yet which base it was. Yeah, but some part of him. The part that had spent 14 months at a hospital bedside, and 3 years under a car, and a lifetime learning that the universe had a sense of humor, as dark as a moonless night. Some part of him already knew, with a sinking, swooping certainty, that the closed door he'd worked so hard to keep shut was about to be kicked clean off its hinges. Daddy! Ethan's small hand found his and gripped it. You're squeezing my hand kind of hard. Daniel opened his eyes, looked down at his boy, made himself smile. Sorry, partner. He loosened his grip. Just thinking. About what? The runway grew closer in the window, gray and long, and flanked by buildings Daniel could already half recognize in shape, if not in name. The unmistakable squared-off geometry of a place built not for travelers, but for warriors. About an old life, Daniel said softly. One I thought I left behind. And the wheels of the airplane reached down through the Kansas sky toward a base full of men and women in uniform, toward hangars and flight lines, and young pilots toward the one place on the entire surface of the earth where a quiet mechanic in grease-stained boots could not possibly, no matter how hard he tried, stay invisible for very much longer. The wheels touched down, soft as a promise. Daniel felt the small chirp of rubber on concrete and the gentle settle of weight And he knew without looking at a single instrument that the man up front knew exactly what he was doing. No bounce, no drama. The captain rode the brakes smooth and easy and brought them down off the speed without a single jolt. And somewhere in the back of the cabin, a passenger started clapping, and a few others joined in, that nervous, grateful applause people give when they've been more scared than they wanted to admit. Ethan was not scared anymore. Ethan had his nose welded to the window and his mouth hanging open. "Daddy?" The word came out in a hush like he was in church. "Daddy, look! Look out there! Daddy, look!" Daniel looked, and his chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the landing. They were rolling past a flight line, and on that flight line, lined up in a row, like sleeping predators, gray and angular and unmistakable, sat a formation of F-22 Raptors. Daniel knew them the way you know the face of someone you used to love. He knew the set of the twin tails. He knew the way the light caught the faceted skin. He knew without being told by the markings on the nearest tail exactly which wing was stationed here. And the second he read those markings, the bottom dropped out of his stomach because of all the bases the captain could have picked of all the runways in all of America. The dice had come up on this one. His old one. Yeah, not the base he'd been stationed at last, but the one that had stood up his old squadron's sister unit. The one where half the men he'd flown with had rotated through. The one where if there was a single soul left who'd been in uniform back in his day, that soul would know exactly one thing the second they heard the words, Hawk 1. "Those are real ones," Ethan breathed. "Daddy, those are the real ones, like in my picture. Like the one you flew." "Yeah, buddy." Daniel's voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Those are the real ones." "Yeah." Across the aisle, the woman in the cream blazer had also seen the fighters, and she'd seen the look on Daniel's face when he saw them, and she filed it away with all the other pieces that weren't fitting the story she'd written. She didn't say anything. She just watched him watch the airplanes, and she saw something in his expression. She did not have a word for a kind of grief and a kind of homecoming all tangled up together. The captain's voice came over the speakers lighter, now relieved. "Well, folks, that's about as smooth as they come. Welcome to a United States Air Force base. I'll let the good people here decide how much of its name they want me sharing. We're going to taxi over to a spot away from their operations, get our maintenance situation looked at, and figure out next steps. I'm going to ask you to be patient with us. This is an active military installation, so I need everyone to stay close to the aircraft and follow crew instructions to the letter once we're inside. Folks here have been gracious enough to take us in, and we're guests. Let's act like it. Thank you all." And it took the better part of 40 minutes to get everyone off and shuttled into a hangar that had been cleared to hold them. The passengers stood around in clusters under the enormous arched ceiling, murmuring, checking phones that mostly had no signal, eyeing the uniformed personnel who moved through with clipboards and quiet purpose. A pair of airmen set up a folding table with water and granola bars. Somebody's toddler started crying and was shushed. The whole thing had the restless, suspended feeling of a delay that nobody could put a number on. Daniel found a spot along the wall away from the crowd and sat Ethan down on the duffel bag. "Stay right here, partner. I mean it. Don't wander. There's a lot of important stuff in a place like this, and we don't touch any of it." "Okay. Okay." Ethan was still vibrating with the wonder of it. "Daddy, can I just look with my eyes? Can I look at the airplanes?" "You can look with your eyes all you want. Just keep your feet right here." And that should have been the end of it. They'd have sat in that hangar an hour. 2 hours, the airline would have found them a replacement aircraft or a fix, and Daniel Carter would have walked back onto a plane and flown to his mother's funeral with his secret intact. The closed door still closed, his quiet, anonymous life still quiet and anonymous. That's how it should have gone. But about 30 feet away, near the open hangar door, 2 young airmen in flight suits were leaning against a tow tractor talking, and Daniel, who could no more turn off his ears than he could turn off his own heartbeat, caught the tail end of what they were saying. "Telling you it's the number 2 hydraulic pack. Same thing happened on the Bird last month. They keep blaming the line, and it's not the line. It's a sensor. It's not a sensor. It's the pack, the pumps cavitating under load and the pressure. Bro, the pump's fine, they pulled it. And Daniel, sitting against the wall 30 feet away with his son on a duffel bag, said quietly, not even really meaning to, mostly to himself, it's neither. He didn't think anyone heard him, but a third man heard him. Is a young pilot, maybe 26-27, with a captain's bars and a face that still had some boy left in it, had been walking past with a coffee, and he stopped. He looked over at the mechanic in the grease-stained boots sitting against the wall with a kid. Say again, the young pilot said. Not rude, curious. Daniel looked up. He should have said nothing, sir. He should have looked back down at his hands and let it go. 3 years of practice and every instinct in him said, let it go, stay small, stay quiet, stay invisible. But the young man's eyes were sharp and honest, and the engineering of the thing was just sitting there in Daniel's head plain as a road map, and some old part of him that he'd buried very deep stirred and wouldn't be quiet. I said it's neither, Daniel told him. It's not the line and it's not the pump. If they swapped the pump and they're still chasing pressure loss under load, it's almost certainly the actuator return circuit. Probably a check valve sticking when the fluid heats up. Gets warm, the seal swells. The valve hangs partway open. You bleed pressure right when you load the system, which is exactly when you'd never want to. Cold on the ground, it tests perfect. Hot under load in the air, it bites you. He paused. That's why nobody can find it on the bench. It only happens when it's flying. The 2 young airmen by the tow tractor had gone quiet. The young pilot was staring at him. That's... The pilot blinked. That's a pretty specific call from across a hangar. You asked. You work on these? The pilot's eyes went to the boots, the hands the kid. Doing the same math everyone did. Coming up with mechanic. You contract maintenance somewhere? No. Daniel almost smiled. I work on cars. Transmissions mostly. The pilot's brow furrowed. Then how in the world do you know the actuator return circuit on an F-22 hydraulic system? And there it was. The question, hanging in the air of the hangar like a struck match. Daniel opened his mouth to deflect it. To say he read a lot. To say he'd done some military contracting years back. Anything to slide back into the gray. He had the deflection half formed on his tongue. And then, Ethan, sitting on the duffel bag, beaming up at the young pilot with his whole heart, said the thing that brought the whole house down. Because my daddy flew them, the boy announced, proud as a trumpet. He flew the Raptor. He was in the Air Force, and he flew the real ones just like those ones right there, and then he stopped because of me. The young pilot's expression flickered. Ethan, Daniel said quietly. Buddy. But Ethan was past stopping now, lit up with the secret he'd only learned an hour ago at 30,000 feet, desperate to share it with the one person in the world who might understand how huge it was. He flew them for a long time. Before I was born, he gave it up so he could take care of me and my mama when she got sick. He's the best one, he told me. The young pilot looked from the boy to the father. You were a Raptor pilot, he said slowly. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he gave one small nod. Long time ago. What unit? Daniel told him. And the young pilot's face did something complicated, because that unit was famous. That unit had history, and a man who'd flown with that unit in the years Daniel's age implied was a man who'd been there for things that were taught now. Things in the books, things the young guys studied with their mouths hanging open. What did they call you? The pilot asked. Very quiet now. Your call sign, what was it? And this was the moment. This was the door hanging on one last hinge. Daniel could feel the whole shape of his careful, anonymous life balanced on the next word out of his mouth. He could lie. He could give a fake one, a forgettable one, and the young man would nod and walk away, and the door would swing shut and stay shut. But Ethan was looking at him. Ethan, who he'd promised, who he'd never once lied to. And the boy's face was so full of pride, so certain his daddy was something true and good. that Daniel found he would not make himself small in front of his son. Not here. Not in the one place on Earth where the thing he'd been was real. Hawk 1, Daniel said. The hangar didn't go silent, not all at once. The young pilot just went still, the way a man goes still when the ground shifts a half-inch under his feet. Say that again, the pilot whispered. Hawk 1. Daniel held his gaze level and calm. That was my call sign. Tio. The young pilot took a step back, not in fear, in something closer to reverence, the involuntary step a man takes when he realizes he's standing closer to something than he understood. His coffee cup hung forgotten in his hand. Hawk 1. He breathed it like it hurt. You're no. The Hawk 1. The one who... He stopped, swallowed. There's a maneuver they teach us. In the schoolhouse. They don't even half the instructors say it's not really flyable, that it got entered into the records wrong. They call it... I know what they call it, Daniel said gently. I flew it. That was you. It was a long time ago, son. But the young pilot wasn't listening anymore. Not really. He'd turned half stumbling toward the two airmen by the tow tractor, and his voice came out shaking. Go get Major Reyes. Go get him right now. And find the senior NCO. Find Chief Donnelly. Tell him. He turned back to Daniel, and his eyes had gone wet and bright. Tell him Hawk 1 is standing in our hangar. The airmen ran, and Daniel Carter felt the door come off its hinges completely. Sir. The young pilot turned back to him, and his voice was thick. Sir, my name's Captain Alvarez. I have to tell you something. The day I got my wings, my instructor sat our whole class down, and he played us gun camera footage, old footage, and he said, this is the standard. This is what the absolute ceiling of this airframe looks like in the hands of a man who understood it better than the engineers who built it. And he never told us your name. He said the name was classified out of the lesson, that it didn't matter, that what mattered was the flying. Alvarez's voice cracked. But we all wanted to know. Every class that ever came through wanted to know who the man in that footage was. And you're sitting in our hangar in, he gestured helplessly, in work boots with your kid. And nobody knew. Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said the only true thing he had. I was just doing my job. Sir, with respect, Alvarez laughed wet and disbelieving. That was not just a job. Word moves through a military base faster than fire through dry grass. By the time Daniel had gotten to his feet, by the time he'd put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, the hangar door had filled with people. Not a crowd, not yet. Just a trickle at first. An older crew chief wiping his hands on a rag who took one look at Daniel's face and went pale and dropped the rag. A maintenance officer who'd been halfway across the apron and started walking faster. A senior master sergeant, Chief Donnelly Gray at the temples, 20-odd years of service in the set of his shoulders, who came through the door at something just short of a run and then stopped dead 40 feet away and stared. I'll be damned. Donnelly said loud enough for the whole hangar to hear. I will be goddamned. Hello, Chief, Daniel said quietly. You don't remember me. Donnelly's voice was unsteady. No reason you would. I was a buck sergeant. I turned wrenches on your bird for 18 months. You used to. He had to stop. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth, this hard old man, this 20-year veteran, and got himself together. You used to come out to the line every single morning before a flight and shake every one of our hands. Every crew chief, every kid on that flight line. You'd look us in the eye and you'd say, I trust you with my life, so thank you for taking care of her. Every morning. Nobody else did that. Officers didn't do that. You did that. The passengers from the flight had begun to notice. The murmur in the hangar had changed pitch. People were turning, drifting closer, sensing without understanding that something was happening, that the quiet mechanic in the grease-stained boots was at the center of it. And the woman in the cream blazer stood at the edge of the crowd and felt the floor tilt under her. And then you were just gone, Donnelly went on. One day, you were the best stick on the whole base, and the next you'd put in your papers and nobody'd say why. And we heard somebody said your wife, He stopped again, looked at the boy standing at Daniel's side, holding the toy F-22. Did the math. His eyes filled. "That's the boy. That's him. That's the one you left it all for." "That's him," Daniel said softly, his hand tightening on Ethan's shoulder. "That's Ethan." Donnelly looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he did something that made the whole hangar go still. He came to attention. This old chief, this senior NCO who'd seen everything, who answered to almost no one, drew himself up ramrod straight in front of a man in oil-stained jeans and a 7-year-old kid. And he saluted. "It's an honor to see you again, Major," Donnelly said, his voice steady as iron, now his hand crisp at his brow. "Sir." Daniel's throat worked. For 3 years, he had been a thing to be looked past, a mechanic, a man with dirty hands, trash in the wrong cabin. And now, an old soldier he barely remembered was standing at attention in front of his son, calling him sir. And Daniel felt the careful wall he'd built around himself crack straight down the middle. He returned the salute, slow, a little rusty, but true. "At ease, Chief," he said roughly. "Please, I'm a civilian now. You don't have to." "With respect, sir," Donnelly said, holding the salute one beat longer. "I'll decide who I salute." And then Major Reyes arrived, and the trickle became a flood. Reyes was the operations officer, mid-40s, and he came through that hangar door at a dead run, and when he saw Daniel, he stopped so hard he nearly fell. "No," he said. "No, no, no, somebody's pulling my leg, that is not." And then he was crossing the floor with his hand already out and his eyes already wet. "Carter. Carter. My God. They told me and I didn't. I flew your tactics, you understand me. When I went through the syllabus, had your engagements in it. Not named. But everybody knew. The ghost in the gun camera footage. And here you are." "Here I am," Daniel said. "Fixing transmissions now mostly." "The hell you are." Reyes gripped his hand in both of his and would not let go. "The hell you are, ma'am." And then more of them came. A flight surgeon. 2 more young pilots jogging in from the squadron building who'd heard the name go around and had to see for themselves. A pair of crew chiefs. A loadmaster. Airmen who hadn't even been born when Hawk 1 flew, who only knew the legend, the footage, the maneuver in the books that half the instructors swore was impossible, and who looked at the man in the grease-stained boots like they were seeing something out of a storybook, walk into the room on 2 legs. One by one, without an order, without anyone telling them to, they came to attention. It started with Donnelly still holding his, then Alvarez snapped to beside him, then Reyes, who let go of Daniel's hand and stepped back and squared his shoulders and brought his hand up sharp, then the 2 crew chiefs. Then the airmen, the young ones, the ones who only knew the legend, falling into line one after another, the way iron filings turn toward a magnet. The whole hangar, pilots, crew chiefs, officers, enlisted, men and women in flight suits and coveralls and service uniforms, dozens of them, now standing at rigid attention in a rough half-circle around a single father in oil-stained jeans and scuffed work boots, every right hand raised in salute. For Hawk 1. And the passengers from the flight, the ones who'd watched him board, who'd seen his dirty hands and his worn-out boots, who'd let a woman call him trash and said nothing, who'd decided in a single glance exactly what kind of nobody he was, stood frozen at the edges of the hangar and watched the United States Air Force salute the man they'd looked straight through. The silence was total. You could have heard a coin drop on the far side of that hangar. Daniel Carter stood in the middle of it with his hand on his son's shoulder, and for the first time in 3 long years, his eyes filled and spilled over, and he let them, because there was no shame in it, because some tears a man has earned. He looked down at Ethan. Dead. And Ethan was not looking at the airplanes anymore. Ethan was looking up at his father, at the rows of men and women standing at attention for him, at the old chief with the steady salute and the wet eyes, and the boy's face was doing something Daniel had never seen it do before. It wasn't just pride. It was understanding. The deep, dawning, life-changing understanding of a child who has just watched the entire world rearrange itself to agree with the one thing he had always known. That his daddy was somebody. That his daddy had always been somebody. "Daddy," Ethan whispered, and his voice was shaking. "Daddy, they're saluting you. All of them. Everybody's saluting you." Daniel knelt down, right there in the center of the hangar in front of all of them. He went down on one knee, so he was level with his son, and he took the boy's small face in both of his big, ruined hands. "You see this, buddy?" His voice broke clean in half. "You see all these good people?" Ethan nodded, tears running freely now. "They're not saluting me because I flew fast. You hear me? That's not what this is." Daniel's thumbs wiped at the boy's cheeks. "They're saluting me because of something a whole lot more important than flying, and I need you to remember it forever." "What?" Ethan whispered. "What is it, Daddy?" But before Daniel could answer, before he could give his son the truest thing, he had a voice came from the back of the hangar, older, weathered, and absolutely thunderstruck. A voice Daniel had not heard in over 3 years, and would have known in his sleep, in his grave, anywhere. "Major Carter." Daniel's whole body went rigid. He knew that voice. Slowly, still on one knee beside his son, he turned toward the hangar door. "That's me." And standing there in the uniform of a man who had clearly climbed several ranks since the last time they'd spoken, with silver in his hair that hadn't been there before, and tears standing openly in his eyes, was the one man on this earth who had sat across a desk from Daniel on the worst day of his life, and shaken his hand like it was the last time. His old commander. The man who'd told him the Air Force takes care of its own. "Colonel Briggs," Daniel breathed. And the old commander walked into that silent hangar through the rows of saluting airmen straight toward the kneeling father and the crying boy, with an expression on his face that said he had been waiting 3 long years to find this man again, and that he had something to say that was going to change everything. Colonel Briggs crossed that hangar like a man walking through his own memory. The rows of airmen held their salute as he passed, and he didn't tell them to stop because he understood better than any of them what they were standing at attention for. He stopped 3 feet from where Daniel knelt beside his son, and for a long moment, the old commander just looked at him. This man he'd written off as lost. 3 years ago, found again in oil-stained jeans on one knee in front of a 7-year-old boy. "Get up here," Briggs said, his voice cracking. "Get up here and let me look at you." Daniel rose. He put Ethan gently behind his leg, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder, and he stood at something close to attention out of pure old reflex. "Sir," he said. "Don't you sir me." Briggs closed the distance and grabbed him both arms, the rough, fierce embrace of a man who'd spent years not knowing whether someone was alive or dead. He held on hard. 3 years, Daniel. 3 years and not a word. You dropped off the face of the earth. I called the number you left. Disconnected. I had people try to find you and you'd just gone, like smoke. I had to disappear, sir," Daniel said quietly into the old man's shoulder. "If I'd stayed in touch, I'd have stayed connected to all of it. And I couldn't do that and be what Ethan needed at the same time. I had to pick one life all the way. So I picked his." Briggs pulled back, held him at arm's length. His eyes moved down to the boy peering out from behind Daniel's leg, and the hard old face went soft as bread. "This him. This is Ethan." Briggs lowered himself, slow joints protesting until he was crouched down to the boy's level. "Hello, Ethan. My name's Tom Briggs. I knew your daddy a long time ago, back when he was the best pilot in the entire United States Air Force." He said it plainly like a fact, because it was one. "You know that? You know that about your daddy?" Ethan nodded wide-eyed. "I know it now. He told me on the plane. He told me he gave it up because of me and my mama." Something moved across Briggs' face. He glanced up at Daniel, and there was a question in it, and Daniel gave the smallest shake of his head, and the colonel understood. He looked back at the boy. "Your daddy," Briggs said carefully. Made the hardest choice a man can make. And I want to tell you something because I was there when he made it." He paused. "I sat across a desk from your father on the day he walked away from all of this. And I'll be honest with you, son, I didn't understand it. Not then. I thought he was throwing away something that only comes along once in a generation. I told him so." "You did." Ethan's brow furrowed. "I did. I was wrong." Briggs's voice thickened. "It took me a long time and a few hard years of my own to understand what your daddy understood right away. That there's no flying, no medal, no title in this whole world worth more than being there for the people you love when they need you. Your daddy didn't quit, Ethan. Quitting is when you run from something hard. Your daddy ran toward the hardest thing there is. He just did it in the other direction from where everybody was looking." He reached out and put a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "And it makes him a better man than any pilot I ever served with, including the Great Hawk 1. You hear me?" Ethan looked up at his father, then back at the colonel. "I hear you," he whispered. Briggs stood, his knees cracking, and he looked at Daniel, and the two men just held each other's eyes for a moment. 3 years, and a whole grief passing silent between them. "Sarah," Briggs said finally. Quiet. "I heard. After. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I didn't know how to find you." "You couldn't have," Daniel said. "I made sure of that. It wasn't on you, sir. She was a hell of a woman. She was the best of all of us." Daniel's voice was steady, but it cost him. "Better than me. Better than the flying. She's the one who made me promise I wouldn't disappear into the grief. Told me to live, to give Ethan a whole father." He looked down at his son. "I've been trying to keep that promise every day since." "You've kept it," Briggs said. "Look at him. You've kept it." For a moment, the whole hangar held its breath around them. Then Briggs seemed to remember they had an audience, and he turned and his voice changed, snapped back into the register of command. "All right. At ease, all of you. At ease." The salutes came down. "But nobody goes anywhere. You hear me? This is, do you all understand what's standing in this hangar right now? Do you?" A young airman near the front, one of the ones who'd only known the legend, spoke up before he could stop himself. "Sir, is it true, the maneuver in the schoolhouse footage? The one they say can't be flown?" "Was that really?" "It was him," Briggs said. "I was his wingman the day he flew it. I watched it with my own eyes from a quarter mile off his wing, and I still don't entirely believe it. And I was there." He looked at Daniel, and a ghost of an old grin tugged at his mouth. "You scared the life out of me that day. You know that I thought I was about to watch you auger straight into the desert. I had the mishap report half written in my head." "I knew the airplane could do it," Daniel said simply. "Nobody knew the airplane could do it. That's the entire point. You made it do it." Briggs shook his head. "Engineers came out afterward, wanted to know how. You sat in a room with a dozen of the smartest people Lockheed had, and you drew it on a whiteboard, and half of them still didn't believe you until they ran the numbers." He turned to the young airman. "So yes, son, it's true, every word of it. The ghost in the footage is standing right there in a pair of work boots holding his kid's hand." The airman looked at Daniel like the floor of heaven had opened up. And it was right about then, in the hush that followed, that a different voice spoke. Small. Strained. From the edge of the crowd where the passengers from the flight had been standing frozen this whole time. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. It was the woman in the cream blazer. She had come a few steps forward out of the cluster of passengers, and she had the look of a person walking toward a firing squad. Her face was blotchy. The expensive composure she'd worn since boarding was gone, completely gone, and what was left underneath was just a frightened, ashamed human being who had finally fully understood what she had done. "Excuse me?" she said again, and her voice shook. I need to say something. To you, in front of all these people. Because I said something to you in front of all the other people, and that's only fair." Daniel turned to face her. He didn't say anything. He just waited, his hand still on his son's shoulder, his expression unreadable. The whole hangar had gone quiet again. The airman, the colonel, The other passengers, all of them watching this woman walk toward the man she'd called trash. "My name is Margaret Chen," she said. "And on that airplane I called you." Her voice failed. She forced it back. "I called you trash. I said you didn't belong. I made your son cry. I knocked his toy onto the floor." Her eyes went to Ethan, and her whole face crumpled. "I knocked a little boy's toy onto the floor because I decided his father wasn't good enough to sit near me. And I have never in my life been so completely, so totally." She couldn't finish it. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Daniel watched her, quiet, steady. "I run a company," Margaret went on when she'd gotten herself back. 200 people. I've spent 30 years telling myself I got there because I'm smart, and I work hard, and I can read people. I read people for a living. I make decisions about people in 30 seconds, and I'm proud of it. A terrible broken laugh escaped her. "And I looked at you for 30 seconds, and I read you completely wrong. Not a little wrong. As wrong as a person can possibly be. You're the most..." She gestured helplessly at the saluting airmen, the colonel, the fighters on the line. "And I called you trash. In front of your son, who you gave up all of this to raise." Ethan stepped out from behind his father's leg. The whole room watched the boy walk toward the woman who'd made him cry. "You were sad," Ethan said. Margaret looked down at him, stricken. "What?" "My daddy said it, on the plane. He said you were probably just having a rough day, and sometimes when people have a rough day, they say things they don't mean. Like when I told my friend Marcus I hated him." Ethan looked up at her with those wide brown eyes. His mother's eyes full of a forgiveness so simple and so total that it knocked the breath clean out of every adult in the hangar. "Were you having a rough day?" Margaret Chen, who ran a company of 200 people who read people for a living, who had never once in 30 years let anyone see her cry, dropped to her knees in front of a 7-year-old boy in the middle of an Air Force hangar and broke completely apart. "Yeah," she choked. "Yeah, sweetheart. I was having a rough day. I've been having a rough day for a long time, I think. And that's no excuse. That's no excuse for what I said to your daddy." "It's okay," Ethan said. "It is not okay. You don't have to say it's okay." "But it is, though." Ethan said it with the unbearable certainty of a child. "Because my daddy told me the most important thing. He said when somebody looks at your clothes or your hands or your money and decides who you are, they're not telling the truth about you. They're telling the truth about themselves." The boy tilted his head. "So you weren't really talking about my daddy at all. You were talking about you, and you were just sad. And now you're not being sad, you're being sorry. So it's okay." Margaret Chen put both hands over her face and wept. And Daniel Carter, who had every right in the world to stand there and let her instead, stepped forward and crouched down beside his son and put a hand on the crying woman's shoulder. "Ms. Chen." She looked up at him, ruined. "My boy just said it better than I ever could." Daniel's voice was gentle, with no cruelty in it anywhere, none of the satisfaction a lesser man would have allowed himself in this moment. "So I'm only going to add one thing." He paused. "You shouldn't have needed to see all this to treat us like people. You shouldn't need to know a man was Hawk 1 to keep from calling him trash. The salute doesn't make me worth your respect. I was worth it on the plane. I was worth it before anybody in this hangar knew my name. So were you. So is every tired person in a pair of worn-out boots you're ever going to look past again." He held her eyes. "That's the lesson. Not that I turned out to be somebody. The lesson is that everybody is somebody, and you don't get to wait for proof." Margaret nodded, unable to speak, the tears streaming. "But I accept your apology," Daniel said. "Fully. We're square. And I mean that." He stood and offered her his hand, his grease-stained, ruined, honest hand. "Now get up off this cold floor before you catch something." She looked at the hand, the dirty hand she'd sneered at 2 hours ago. And she took it and let the man she'd called trash help her to her feet, and she held on to it a second longer than she needed to. like she was trying to apologize through her grip for every assumption she'd ever made about a pair of dirty hands in her whole life. Around them, the hangar had gone wet-eyed and silent. A couple of the young airmen were openly crying and not bothering to hide it. Chief Donnelly had his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Even Colonel Briggs had a hand pressed over his mouth. And the other passengers, the ones who'd stayed silent on that plane, who'd let it happen, who'd smirked or looked away, stood there changed. You could see it in them. The businessman from 3B, who wouldn't make eye contact, had his head down. A woman who'd whispered something cruel 2 hours ago was crying into her husband's shoulder. They had all watched a child forgive what they themselves had been too cowardly to even speak against, and not one of them would forget it as long as they lived. Briggs cleared his throat roughly. "All right," he said. "All right. Let's Daniel walk with me. Both of you. I want to show your boy something." He looked down at Ethan and managed a watery smile. "Son, how would you like to see a real F-22 Raptor up close enough to touch?" Ethan's mouth fell open. He looked up at his father, asking permission with his whole face. "Go on, buddy," Daniel said, his voice thick. "Go see her." They walked out onto the flight line together, the colonel and the legend and the little boy, and behind them came a respectful procession. Donnelly, Reyes, Alvarez, a dozen airmen who would not have missed this for anything in the world. The passengers were kept back near the hangar, but they watched. Everyone watched. The nearest Raptor sat gleaming gray in the afternoon, and as they approached it, Daniel Carter slowed. He had not stood next to one of these in over 3 years. He'd told himself he never would again. He'd packed that part of his soul in a box and shut it in an attic and walked away, and he'd meant it. He'd truly meant it. And now here it was. The machine he'd loved second only to his family. The thing he'd been the best in the entire world at flying. Close enough to touch. He reached out one ruined hand and laid it flat against the cool skin of the fuselage, and he had to close his eyes. "Hello, old girl," he said so quiet only Ethan and Briggs could hear it. "Daddy." Ethan tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, are you sad?" Daniel opened his eyes. They were wet. "No, buddy, not sad." He shook his head slowly. "It's just, there was a part of me I thought I'd never get to say goodbye to properly. And here it is. Turns out I get to say hello and goodbye at the same time. That's all. That's a good thing. That's a real good thing." Briggs put a hand on his shoulder. "You want to sit in her?" Daniel's head came up sharp. "What?" "You heard me." Briggs nodded toward the cockpit. "She's down for maintenance anyway. Won't hurt a thing. I'm still got enough stars on this base to make it happen." His eyes glinted. "Let your boy watch his daddy in the seat one time. Give him that. Give yourself that." Daniel stood there, his hand on the airplane, his son looking up at him, and for a long moment he couldn't speak at all. "Reyes," Briggs said, "get the ladder." What happened next, Ethan Carter would remember for the rest of his life. He would remember it when he was old. He would remember it as the single best moment of his entire childhood, better than any Christmas, better than anything. Dishe. He watched the crew roll a ladder up to the side of that gray fighter. He watched 2 airmen steady it. And he watched his daddy in the oil-stained jeans and the worn-out boots. His daddy with the dirty hands. His daddy who fixed transmissions and skipped lunches, and tucked him in every single night, climb that ladder and lower himself down into the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor like he had never once left it. Daniel's hands found the controls without being told where they were. Muscle memory. 3 years deep surged up through him. His fingers settled onto the stick and the throttle. And it was like coming home to a house you grew up in, every light switch exactly where your hand remembers. The young airmen on the flight line had gone silent. They were watching a ghost settle into his old chair. And down below on the concrete, a 7-year-old boy stood with his toy F-22 clutched to his chest and looked up at his father in the real one, and his small face was lit up like the sun had come down out of the sky and landed right there on the flight line, just for him. "Daddy!" Ethan shouted, jumping up and down, waving his toy. "Daddy, you're in it! You're really in it!" Daniel looked down over the side of the cockpit at his son. And the smile that broke across his face was the freest, lightest, most unguarded smile that any of them had seen from him all day. The smile of a man who had spent 3 years being looked through, called trash ground, down by the world's cheap judgment, and who was now, for one shining moment, exactly fully himself with his boy, watching in the place where he'd once been a legend. "I'm in it, buddy," he called down, laughing, his voice cracking with joy. "I'm in it." Chief Donnelly, standing at the base of the ladder, turned his face away and wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand and didn't care who saw. And Colonel Briggs stood back with his arms crossed, watching the whole thing. The father in the cockpit. The boy below, the airmen gathered round the passengers in the distance, who'd learned the hardest lesson of their lives that afternoon, and the old commander got a particular look in his eye. The look of a man forming a plan. Because Tom Briggs had not climbed to the rank he held by being sentimental. He was sentimental right now, sure they all were. You'd have to be made of stone not to be. But underneath the tears, the wheels were already turning, and what they were turning toward was this: that the United States Air Force had just rediscovered, by pure blind chance on a random Tuesday, the finest fighter pilot it had ever produced, a man who understood courage and sacrifice and leadership in his bones, standing in a hangar in a pair of work boots. And Briggs was not about to let him walk back onto a commercial flight and disappear into smoke a second time. Not without making him an offer first. He waited until Daniel had climbed back down the ladder, until the boy had thrown both arms around his father's legs, until the worst of the tears had passed, and the afternoon had settled into something quieter. Then he walked over, and he put a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and he said the words that would hang in the air for the rest of the day. "Daniel, before you get back on that airplane, there's something I need to ask you, and I need you to hear me all the way out before you say no." "All right, sir," Daniel said. "I'm listening." Briggs glanced down at Ethan, then back up. "Maybe we let the boy go look at the airplane with Chief Donnelly for a minute. This is a grown-up conversation, and I'd like your full attention for it. Whatever you've got to say, you can say in front of my son." Daniel's hand settled on Ethan's shoulder. "I don't keep things from him. Learned that lesson the hard way about 3 hours ago on the plane." Briggs studied him a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He drew a breath. "Daniel, I'm going to be straight with you the way you've always been straight with me. The Air Force needs you." Daniel's face closed up just slightly. "Sir, hear me out. All the way out. You promised." Briggs held up a hand. "I'm not asking you to fly again. I know better. I watched you make your choice 3 years ago, and I've come to respect it more than just about any decision I've seen a man make. I'm not here to undo it." He paused. "But there is something I'm asking. We've got a problem in this Air Force that money can't fix and fancy simulators can't fix. We're producing pilots who can operate the airplane. Technically perfect. Hands like surgeons. And every year a few more of them roll off the line knowing everything about the machine and nothing about what it costs to be the man inside it." Daniel went still. "They don't know sacrifice, Daniel. Not really. They know it as a word in a ceremony. They've never sat across a desk and given up the thing they loved most for someone they loved more. They've never had to. And the ones who eventually do face it, and they all do sooner or later, every one of them hits a moment where the mission asks for everything. Half of them break because nobody ever showed them what it looks like to carry that weight and stay standing." Briggs's voice dropped. "You did, son. You carried the heaviest thing a man can carry. And you didn't break, and you didn't get bitter, and you turned yourself into a transmission mechanic and raised a boy who just forgave a woman who called his father garbage. That, Daniel. That is the thing we cannot teach. And you've got it." Around them, the airmen had gone quiet again. Reyes, Alvarez, the young ones, listening. "I want you to come teach," Briggs said. "Part-time, on your terms, around his schedule." He nodded at Ethan. Not a recruiter's pitch, I mean it on your terms. Come a few days a month. Sit in a room with these young pilots and tell them the truth. Not the flying. They've got instructors coming out their ears for the flying. I want you to teach them the part that's not in any manual. What it means to lead. What it means to put the people under you ahead of your own glory. What it means to walk away from the sky for somebody who needs you more. The human part. The part that decides whether they become officers worth following or just very expensive button pushers. He stopped. Will you at least think about it? For a long moment, Daniel didn't answer. He looked down at Ethan. The boy was looking up at him, holding his toy F-22. His whole small face open and waiting. And Daniel could see the want in it. Say yes, Daddy. Say yes. And he could also see something more careful underneath. Because this was a boy who had learned that his father's choices were not simple, that his father had given up the sky once, and that it had cost him something Ethan was only just beginning to understand. Sir, Daniel said finally, I need you to understand something, and I need these young men and women to hear it too, because it's the only thing I'd have to teach them anyway. He turned so the airmen could hear him. 3 years ago, I sat in this man's office, and I gave up everything I'd worked my whole life to become. And people called it a sacrifice. It wasn't. A sacrifice is when you give up something you want for something you want more. I didn't sacrifice the sky. I chose my son. Those are different things, and the difference is everything. He put his hand on Ethan's head. My job is this boy. It was my job 3 years ago when Sarah was dying, and it's my job today. And it's going to be my job until the day he doesn't need me anymore, which I'm in no hurry for. That is the mission. Everything else, the flying, the teaching, all of it. Everything else only happens if it fits around that. Not the other way around. Never the other way around. He looked back at Briggs. If I say yes to you, sir, it's only because saying yes makes me a better father, not a worse one. Because my boy gets to see his daddy stand in front of a room and be useful again. Because the money would mean he never has to watch me skip another lunch. Because maybe some young pilot I talk to someday makes a choice for his family that he wouldn't have made otherwise, and that's a thing Ethan can be proud his daddy did. He paused. But the second it asks me to choose it over him, I walk. Same as I walked before. No hesitation. You'd have to know that going in. Briggs was quiet. Then a slow smile spread across his weathered face. Daniel, he said, the fact that you just said all of that in front of my airmen instead of just taking the job, that's the entire reason I'm offering it to you. He stuck out his hand. Those are exactly the terms. The boy comes first. That's not a condition I'm tolerating. That's the curriculum. Daniel looked at the offered hand. He looked down at his son. Ethan, he said quietly, this one's partly yours. You and me were a team, so I'm asking, what do you think? Ethan looked at the colonel, then at the airplanes, then up at his father, and the boy's face was doing that grown-up thing again, that careful weighing far too big for a 7-year-old. Would you have to go away? Ethan asked. Like before for months. No, buddy. Just a few days here and there. I'd always come home. Every time. And you'd still fix cars. Some? We'll see. Might not have to so much. Daniel crouched down to his level. But here's the real question, partner, and I want your honest answer. These young pilots, they don't know what you and me know. They don't know what it costs to love somebody more than a dream. You and me, we learned that the hardest way there is. We learned it from Mama. His voice caught. Do you think your daddy ought to go teach them? Tell them about the kind of man who'd give up the sky for his family. Ethan thought about it. Really thought about it. His little brow furrowed. Then he looked up, and his eyes were bright, and he said the thing that decided it. You should tell them about Mama, Ethan said. So they know she was real, so somebody else knows her name. The whole flight line went silent. Daniel Carter put his hand over his mouth and his shoulders shook. And for a moment, this strong, quiet man who had not let the world break him in 3 long years could not speak at all. Then he gathered his son up into his arms and stood and held him against his chest, and he reached out one hand and he gripped Colonel Briggs's hand hard. "Yes," he said, his voice wrecked. "Yes, sir. On those terms, I'll come teach." The hangar erupted. The airmen broke into applause, and a few of them whooped, and Reyes pumped his fist in the air, and Alvarez was grinning so wide it looked like it hurt, and Chief Donnelly was clapping with his big scarred hands and shaking his head like he couldn't believe the day he was having. The sound of it rolled out across the flight line, and even the passengers kept back by the hangar started clapping. Too swept up in something they only half understood but felt all the way down. And Margaret Chen, standing among those passengers, clapped hardest of all, with tears running down her face. A woman who'd boarded that morning, certain she knew exactly how the world was sorted, and who was about to get off a very different airplane than the one she'd gotten on. It took another 2 hours for the airline to sort out the replacement aircraft. The hydraulic fault turned out to be exactly what Daniel had called from across the hangar, a check valve in the actuator return circuit sticking, when the fluid warmed under load invisible on every cold ground test. When the maintenance officer came back and confirmed it, he walked straight up to Daniel and shook his head and said, "Sir, you diagnosed in 8 seconds from 60 feet away, with your kid on your lap. A fault that's had my best techs chasing their tails for 5 weeks. I don't know whether to thank you or resign." And Daniel had laughed, really laughed, and said, "Don't resign. It only shows up hot. You'd never have caught it on the bench. Nobody would. That's not on you." And the man had walked away standing a little taller. When the call finally came that the new aircraft was ready, the goodbyes took a while. Reyes made Daniel promise that the teaching wasn't a one-time thing, that he'd really come, and Daniel promised. Alvarez, the young captain who'd recognized the name first, asked if he could shake Hawk One's hand one more time, and when Daniel obliged, the kid held on and said, "Sir, I'm going to fly better for the rest of my career because I met you today. I just want you to know that." And Daniel told him the only thing that mattered, then fly safe and come home to whoever's waiting for you. That's all the flying better that counts. Chief Donnelly was the last of the uniforms. The old man came up and stood in front of Daniel and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, and he pressed it into Daniel's hand. It was a unit coin worn smooth at the edges, the kind a man carries for decades. "I've had that since I was a buck sergeant," Donnelly said gruffly. "Turning wrenches on your bird. I want the boy to have it. So he's got something to hold that proves today was real when he's grown, and he thinks maybe he dreamed it." He looked at Ethan. "You take care of your daddy, you hear me, young man? He's the genuine article. They don't make many." Ethan took the coin in both hands, like it was made of starlight. "I'll take care of him," he said solemnly. "I always do." And Donnelly, 22 years in uniform, had to turn around and walk away fast. Then it was Margaret Chen. She approached the way you approach something you're not sure you're allowed to touch. She'd composed herself by now, mostly, but the composure was different than it had been that morning. Softer, humbler, a thing earned back rather than worn for show. "I won't keep you," she said. I have something I'd like to give you, and I need you to not refuse it because it's not charity, and it's not me trying to buy off my conscience." "All right, just hear me out." She reached into her bag and pulled out a card. "I run a logistics company. 200 employees, like I said. We've got a fleet trucks, vans, a maintenance operation that is frankly a disaster, because I've never been able to find a shop manager I trust to run it like it matters." She held out the card. "I'm not offering you a mechanic's job. I'm offering you the job of running the whole thing. Your hours. Near your son's school, I'll relocate the operation if I have to, I'm not kidding. Triple what a transmission shop pays. Because I have spent 30 years hiring people based on what they look like in 30 seconds, and today I learned exactly what that's worth. And I would like to hire one person just once based on who he actually is." Daniel looked at the card. He didn't take it right away. "Ms. Chen," he said. "Why? Because..." Her voice wavered. Because you helped me. On the plane. When the seatbelt sign came on and I was terrified, you leaned across the aisle and you talked me down, and you had no reason on God's earth to do that. I'd called you trash an hour before, and you talked me through my fear like I was a person worth saving. She swallowed. You didn't owe me a thing, and you helped me anyway. That's the man I want running my operation. Not Hawk 1, not the legend. The man who helps the woman who insulted him because she's scared. She pushed the card a little closer. Please, let me hire him. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he took the card. I'll think about it, he said. I'll really think about it. I've got the teaching now too, so I'd have to see how it all fits around Ethan. But... He met her eyes. Thank you. Not for the job, for learning the lesson out loud in front of everybody when it would have been a whole lot easier to just slink off this base and never think about it again. That took more courage than most people have got. You should know that about yourself. Margaret Chen pressed her lips together and nodded, unable to speak, and for the second time that day, a woman who'd never let anyone see her cry let the tears come without shame. The new aircraft was a different crew, a different cabin, but somehow the same people changed. When Daniel and Ethan boarded, and this time when the gate agent saw the grease-stained boots and the worn jeans, Colonel Briggs himself was standing there in his uniform to personally walk them down the jet bridge, and the agent's eyes went wide as dinner plates. The other passengers were already in their seats. And as Daniel carried his sleepy son down the aisle to their row, something happened that had never once happened to him in 3 years of being looked through. A man in a business suit stood up as he passed. Thank you for your service, sir. Then a woman 2 rows back. Thank you, sir. Then another. And another. Up and down the cabin, the passengers, the same ones who'd smirked that morning, who'd let a child be insulted and said nothing, rose from their seats one after another, and thanked the quiet father in the dirty boots for his service. Some of them couldn't meet his eyes. They were ashamed, and they should have been. But they stood and they said it, and it was the closest thing to an apology that a whole plane load of strangers knows how to give. Daniel accepted each one with a small nod. He didn't gloat. He didn't make them feel it. He just said thank you back, quiet and even, and carried his son to their seats. And as he settled Ethan in by the window seat, always the window seat so the boy could watch the flaps move, a small voice from across the aisle said, "Sir." It was a boy, maybe 10 years old, traveling with his mother, who'd watched the whole thing. "Sir, is it true? Were you really a fighter pilot?" Daniel looked at the kid. Then he looked at Ethan, who was already nodding furiously, ready to tell the whole story. "You know what, son," Daniel said. "I'll let my boy tell you. He tells it better than I do." He ruffled Ethan's hair. "Go on, partner. Tell him about Hawk 1. And as the plane pushed back from the gate and turned toward the runway, Ethan Carter leaned across the aisle and began to tell another child the story of his father. Not the story of the fastest pilot, not the story of the legend in the gun camera footage, but the only story that had ever mattered. The story of a man who loved someone more than the sky. Daniel sat back in his seat and closed his eyes and listened to his son's voice, bright and proud and full of love, telling the truth about him to a stranger. The engines spooled up. The plane lifted off into the late afternoon and climbed toward home, where a fresh grave waited in Virginia, and a hard goodbye still had to be said to the mother who'd called Ethan her little aviator. There was grief still ahead. There always was. That was the price of loving people. You paid it at both ends. Woo! But Daniel Carter was not invisible anymore. Not to the Air Force that had saluted him. Not to the passengers who'd thanked him. Not to the woman who'd called him trash and learned the hardest possible way that she'd been wrong about everything. And most of all, not to the 7-year-old boy across the aisle, who now knew all the way down to his bones exactly what kind of man his father was. 3 years he had spent being judged by his boots and his hands and his clothes. 3 years of swallowing it, of staying small, of letting the world believe whatever cheap thing it wanted to believe, because protecting his son's childhood had mattered more than protecting his own pride. And in the end, the world had not figured out his worth because he'd finally shown them the medals. The world had figured out his worth the moment a child forgave a cruel woman, the moment a man helped someone who'd wounded him, the moment a father got down on one knee in a hangar and taught his son that everyone is somebody, and you don't get to wait for proof. The salute hadn't made Daniel Carter worth respecting. He had always been worth it. He'd been worth it in the cockpit, and worth it under a car, and worth it in seat 4C with grease on his hands and a sneer aimed at his head. The only thing that ever changed was who finally had the eyes to see it. And as the plane carried him home through a sky he'd once owned and given away for love. Daniel Carter held his son's hand across the aisle, and he understood at last the truest thing of all, that a man's worth is never in the medals he earns, or the machines he masters, or the speed at which he flies. A man's worth is in what he's willing to give up and who he gives it up for. Daniel had given up the sky, and he had gained a son who would carry the truth of him into every room he ever entered for the rest of his life. That was the victory. That was the whole victory. And no one, not a businesswoman in a cream blazer, not a plane load of strangers, not the entire United States Air Force standing at attention, could ever take it from him, because he had never needed any of them to grant it in the first place. He had earned it himself, one quiet, invisible, grease-stained day, at a time the only way real worth is ever earned, and that is a thing no one can ever mock again.